Phil, the New York badass Baron, was once larger than life. Explosive knockouts, theatrical cage climbs, and a personality as loud as his punches made him impossible to ignore. For a time, he was among the most entertaining fighters in mixed martial arts. But at 49 years old, the story is no longer about highlight reels or victories. Today, it's about tragedy. Baron sits in a Mexican prison, accused of aggravated femicide, staring down the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. The question now is, how did a fighter who once lit up the UFC and PRIDE rings end up in this position? To understand that, you have to trace his journey from humble beginnings to global notoriety. Born in Long Island, New York, in 1976, Baron grew up in a tough, working-class environment where toughness wasn't optional, it was survival. Wrestling became his first escape from that world. At Nassau Community College, he made his mark as a two-time All-American before transferring to Hofstra and eventually Central Michigan. Coaches described him as raw but relentless, a natural competitor who thrived on intensity. And even back then, his personality stood out, cocky, brash, and unapologetically loud. He wasn't just trying to win matches, he was trying to own the room. When mixed martial arts began exploding in the late 1990s, Baron knew he had found his true stage. With a foundation in wrestling and surprising knockout power in his hands, he transitioned quickly. By the early 2000s, he was already earning attention with his brawling style. His UFC debut in 2001 against Curtis Stout showed his relentless pressure, securing him a unanimous decision win. But it was his next big moment, a fight against former champion Dave Mina, that launched him into stardom. In only 18 seconds, Baron flattened Mina with a barrage of punches, then leapt onto the cage screaming that he was the best Eva. In that instant, a new MMA showman was born. From there, his fame snowballed. Baron signed with PRIDE, one of the most prestigious organizations in Japan, and quickly became a fan favorite. His entrances were wild, his charisma undeniable, and his knockouts devastating. He scored big wins against Ikuhisa Minowa, Ryo Chonan, and Yuki Kondo, proving he wasn't just a hype machine. Japanese fans adored his rockstar energy. Even when he lost, he did it with spectacle, and promoters knew he was money. But behind the flash, cracks were forming. His fighting style was reckless. He believed his fists could solve every problem, often refusing to adapt or prepare properly. While others drilled game plans and refined their skills, Baron sometimes coasted, relying on swagger over structure. His record became inconsistent. He was a star, yes, but not a champion. For a brief window in the mid-2000s, Baron was living the dream. He had movie star looks, a chiseled physique, and a fighting style that kept crowds roaring. He made crossover appearances on television, flirted with professional wrestling, and became a go-to face for hyping big MMA events. He was polarizing, fans either loved him or couldn't stand him, but nobody ignored him. Yet, as the showman side of Baron grew louder, the fighter inside him grew weaker. He lost rematches to top contenders like Matt Lindland and suffered defeats to veterans like Evan Tanner. He became known less as a serious title threat and more as a guaranteed exciting fight. His record slipped closer to .500, and as the sport evolved, Baron's reliance on boxing left him behind. He was flashy but one-dimensional. It wasn't just skill decline, it was discipline. Stories began surfacing about his training habits. He was unpredictable in the gym, sometimes skipping technical work, sometimes overtraining, sometimes starting fights with his own teammates. Partying, drinking, and distractions outside the cage chipped away at his career. A failed steroid test in 2007 after his Strikeforce bout against Frank Shamrock brought a 6-month suspension and further damaged his reputation. Fans started whispering that Baron was becoming a cautionary tale, a man with all the gifts but none of the control to reach true greatness. Still, Baron refused to fade away. He bounced from organization to organization, Elite XC, Strikeforce, Pride, Dream, Bellator, ONE FC, taking fights wherever promoters would have him. He would fight anyone, anywhere, but the more he fought, the more his decline showed. His body absorbed punishment, his reflexes dulled, and the bright spotlight that once chased him dimmed. Outside the cage, his brash persona only grew. He publicly defended controversial figures like War Machine, whose own violent crimes horrified the MMA world. Baron painted himself as the eternal outlaw, but by this point, the line between badass and self-destructive was almost invisible. By the 2010s, he was no longer feared as a contender. He was a journeyman, a sideshow act whose charisma carried him further than his fighting skills. The contrast between Phil Barron the performer and Phil Barron the fighter was becoming painfully obvious. Then came the darkest turn of all. On January 1, 2023, Mexican authorities announced the arrest of Phil Barron in San Pancho, Nayarit. The reports were horrifying. According to Barron, his girlfriend had slipped and fallen in the shower. But when investigators arrived, they found her body covered in more than 37 bruises and injuries. The explanation didn't match the evidence. Witnesses claimed they'd heard arguments and shouting from the room earlier that night. Neighbors described Barron as volatile, quick to anger, prone to loud outbursts. Within days, prosecutors charged him with aggravated femicide, one of Mexico's most severe criminal charges. If convicted, he faced 30 to 75 years in prison. For MMA fans, the news hit like a hammer. This wasn't just another fighter with a DUI or bar fight. This was femicide. A crime that carried a weight far beyond sports. Barron was transferred to Venustiano Carranza State Prison in Tepic, Nayarit. Suddenly, the man who once strutted into Tokyo arenas to screaming crowds was just another inmate in a crowded, dangerous cell block. The prison is infamous for its harsh conditions, overcrowding, violence, limited resources. For Barron, who had lived off adoration and spectacle, the silence of prison life must have been unbearable. Gone were the cameras, the chants, the lights. His only audience now was guards and fellow prisoners. To them, he wasn't a fighter. He was an accused killer. The MMA community's reaction was mixed: shock, heartbreak, disgust. Fighters who knew him as a teammate expressed disbelief. Others admitted they weren't surprised, saying his volatility had been obvious for years. Journalists covered the story soberly, stressing that this was no longer about sports but about a woman's life lost. In Mexico, the case took on even greater weight. Femicide is a national crisis, with thousands of women murdered each year and too many cases going unpunished. Activist groups demanded that Barron face the full severity of the law, pointing out that his celebrity should not shield him. In the United States, the case reignited debates about MMA's dark side. Did years of brain trauma, substance abuse, and mental decline play a role in Barron's violence? Or was this simply the result of arrogance and unchecked behavior spiraling out of control? Some argued possible CTE, citing his mood swings, erratic interviews, and memory lapses in later years. Others rejected excuses outright. What was undeniable was the tragedy. A woman had lost her life, and a once promising fighter's story had collapsed into ruin. As images leaked from prison, fans were stunned at Barron's appearance. The once chiseled physique that symbolized the New York badass was gone. He looked older, softer, almost unrecognizable. Reports suggested he struggled to adapt to the brutal environment. Friends described him as a shell of his former self, burned out from years of punishment and unable to cope with life after fighting. At 49, Barron was no longer an athlete, not a commentator, not even a coach. He was just another inmate, awaiting trial in a foreign prison, his legacy permanently scarred. His story had shifted from a man celebrated for knockouts to one condemned for violence. For fans, the reckoning was painful. They remembered the swagger, the chaos, the highlight reels. But those memories were now stained. His name no longer evoked cheers, it evoked shame. He had gone from a pioneer of MMA's wild early days to a cautionary tale of wasted talent and self-destruction. When people look back now, they don't see the fighter who shouted he was the best ever. They see a mugshot. They see a courtroom. They see a man who lost everything, his career, his freedom, his legacy, because of his final acts.